Now the story of a World Wide Web that connected everything, and the one YouTuber who had no choice but to keep it all apart. It's spoiler, I hardly. House of the Dragon, for those who are not in the know, is, strictly speaking, you call it a prequel series to Game of Thrones. I'd say more just, it takes place within the same world as Game of Thrones. It is well over 100 years beforehand. Everyone who exists in the show is dead long before the events of Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is set in the aftermath of the Targaryen dynasty. House of the Dragon is, here is the Targaryen dynasty at its height. What happens within this dynasty when you get a dynastic power struggle, essentially. Spoiler warning for the first 2 seasons of House of the Dragon. I have not read Fire and Blood, which is the book that is adapted into the 4 seasons of House of the Dragon. I really do not know what happens in the remaining 2 seasons. We can get stuck right into this because I don't expect to tick much off the bingo, and then I have a lot of thoughts about this episode. Let's check in on the bingo. How is it going after Season 3, Episode 3, Rhaenyra Triumphant? Rhaenyra Triumphant, that's the name of the episode. And there will be spoilers, of course, for the 3 episodes of the season that have happened so far and all that has come before, and nothing for anything coming up, because I don't know what's happening. House words. I don't believe we got any house words. Dead Targaryen in flashback/vision. We got a lot of talk throughout this episode about Viserys, about history, but no dice on him actually popping up yet, but it does give me a lot of hope that we will get Paddy Considine popping up at some point later in the season. I really like how they keep returning to him as a model for rulership, particularly in the later discussion of the episode, where Daemon is kind of like, I made my peace with him, but, which is really interesting phrasing in and of itself. It's not Daemon saying, I loved him dearly, but he was too weak to govern. It's Daemon saying, we had our struggles, and I'm talking to you now as someone who's not coming from that past grudge that's, dead and gone. What I'm talking about here is Viserys is not precisely who you should be modeling your rule on. Valyrian Dagger has not popped up yet. IB Pride Month Westeros, no. Aemond Larps as Daemon. We get no Aemond throughout this entire episode. We get a mention that he went into Harrenhal and then disappeared, so presumably Alice Rivers, or that woman, a maester of sorts, has carted him off somewhere, but yeah, no, nothing. I do also like how when Daemon says that line where he shows an unusual amount of interest in this woman, Grand Maester Orwell is just instantly like, yeah, I never heard of her. Like, we would have her on file, I'm the Grand Maester, I'm responsible for everyone in the organization. Pretty sure I'd remember if I sent someone out to Harrenhal. Obviously, Alice Rivers is not a Maester, and Daemon knows that, but it's a nice, smart example of a character responding in a logical way. Essos appears. No. There is Essos mention when Daemon starts going off with his world conquest visions about we should take over Dorne, then we should take over Essos, then we should go and pillage Yi, and I don't know what he's talking about with the city to the east where the men have wings. 2 guesses. Number 1 is just, if we're talking about the city that's furthest to the east, that's non, it'd be Ashai. But, I've never heard anything about men with wings associated with it. The other guess is this might actually be referencing Meereen, because they put a lot of stock in the harpy there as their kind of sigil symbol. And so it would be a juicy little bit of historical irony if Rhaenyra and Daemon have ambitions on someday I would like to see Meereen, because I'm assuming with 14 episodes left in this show, they're probably not going to go to Meereen, or at least not in the duration of the show. Who knows, maybe they survive it all and then sail off there in a boat afterwards. But the irony being, of course, that from the main series, it does eventually pop up as something to do with Daenerys. I'm being very oblique here because I don't, want to talk further about A Song of Ice and Fire or Game of Thrones spoilers, but Meereen does indeed come up in the Daenerys plotline as here is a Targaryen out in Essos. Dragons die. Nope, they're all good this episode. The closest we got to it was the question of whether Daeron's dragon would come into conflict with Daemon and his squad at the start of the story. Didn't happen. Westerosi history. Don't actually think there were any history lessons through this episode, no. Yeah, somehow, I like the argument a lot with the High Septon, but somehow he doesn't go into a historical rant about prior conflict between the Faith and the Targaryens, because I'm pretty sure So I don't know this Westerosi history backstory stuff that well compared to the A Song of Ice and Fire period, but I'm pretty sure one of the early kings, maybe it's Maegor, gets into a lot of conflict with the faith, and there's a little bit of a civil war over it, and that is why at the end of it, the Targaryens get to rule dominant with their dragons and their marriages and everything, even though the faith disapproves. And it's why the faith militant get disbanded, because then in the main series, eventually it falls to a certain wily coyote in King's Landing in the Red Keep to review those old laws about the faith militant. Ships sink, we've already dealt with that. Although I would say this episode certainly does nothing to sink ships vis-a-vis Rhaenyra on any front. A Kotsk reference? Nope, nothing. Kristen Cole acts like Jom/Anakin. Again, we don't see anything up in that northern area, which is, relatively north, which is interesting because presumably by now, Kristen's host should be approaching Harrenhal. Like, I could see the next episode starting with them filtering in and being like, why is literally no one here? There's just dead bodies. That's kind of unnerving. Larys is on fire. Again, this is a very limited episode in its scope. It's really sinking in for me now. There is no Aegon. There is no Larys. They're just continuing their cross-country road trip to Rook's Rest. Sweet Home Valyria. None of that in this episode. Dragon does something suicidal. No, they're completely chill throughout this one in the one scene they appear in. Avengers Endgame. There's no teaming up. I'm going over the ones I've already ticked off just because it's still fun to talk about if they appear, but we're not going to need to talk about Otto Death Stare again. Sadly, we barely got any actual discussion between Alicent and Rhaenyra over that, which seems like a real missed opportunity given the very complicated feelings Alicent has for Otto as a horrible person who ruined her life but is also her dad. And, there is a kind of meta to it where Alicent has ended up occupying the Otto role of pushing other people into places they don't want to be in. And now, Alicent and Helena being in captivity together is not miles off from what it would be like with Otto and Alicent in captivity together, if that makes sense. Because in both cases, it is the child being like, I didn't want any of this, why did you push me into being here? Even though obviously Alicent has started to try to do the right thing instead. Heads roll, no, I think this is a completely violence-free, blood-free episode. Unless you count all those poor rats. Cat. Sadly, the hopes for any cats are really receding because my hope was the idea of lots of cats getting flushed into the Red Keep to take out all the rats could be introduced later in the story than it was, to my knowledge, in Fire and Blood, where I believe it's Otto who does that back then. But nope, instead they just get used for getting served up as a metaphor by Rhaenyra, which, cool, sure, and we can come to talking about that in a bit. Backs stabbed. Everyone's pretty same-teamy in this one, it's fine. Grand Maester Orwell conspires. I literally cannot think of anything Orwell does in this episode other than his line about Alice, and being like, I swear I don't know where the money is. He is once again playing it completely straight. Aegon. I'm not going to count it, obviously, but it's not a direction I expected, and it makes perfect sense that Rhaenyra has just decided to buy into the very dangerous lie that I think it's Alicent suggests in the first place, which is, well, he was actually really badly injured, and then he disappeared. Just declare him dead. Obviously that's the kind of thing that's going to cause you all kinds of trouble down the line. Obviously you should do your due diligence instead. But I can completely understand in this day and age where you don't have the same kind of level of law enforcement that you do now, or technology to hunt someone down, and for that matter, there's not the same kind of technology to keep people alive. I can totally understand where you just be like, damn, we will never find this one random guy who, the vast majority of people don't even know what he looks like anymore. He is probably not going to make it on his own anyway. Screw it. I'm sure this has happened throughout history all the time, where someone does just disappear and life goes on, even though they were once super important. Peaceful retirement. Alicent and Helena are getting closer to it. Now that we have an actual deadline set on it, once Aemond is dealt with, you two can go free. That's pretty generous. I'd be pretty happy with that. Night in full plate goes over. Yeah, we've already dealt with that. Rhaenyra and Alicent communicate. Well, yes, it's finally happened. We get a few good discussions throughout this episode. And that was one of the things I was finding really exciting. Even if we
had a little time skip at the start, and I was sad we missed out on a proper discussion between them. I really like this kind of vibe, and I hope it continues, of Rhaenyra kind of coming to Alicent as her advisor when she's struggling with everyone else around her is demanding things of her, and she can turn to Alicent as, you are someone who's actually experienced having all these demands on you instead of just being the one who wants something from me, because we've already settled through this episode the terms of what Alicent is going to get out of Rhaenyra. There's nothing more to worry about on that front. You've been here before. What can you tell me about how do I do this? And I hope it leads to some kind of rapprochement between them. And I think that gets super interesting if Alicent becomes an advisor to Rhaenyra, because obviously everyone else in the Black faction will massively mistrust that and want to weed out her influence. Finally, for weddings and or funerals, none of either of these, although I would say that Alicent securing agreement from Rhaenyra to send back Otto's body means we could see at least one funeral, but now, who knows if that's going to happen, because the big twist of this episode that I didn't expect is the Hightowers are absolutely going to continue the war. The road to Old Town is blocked, the Rose Road is gone, and they are occupying Tumbleton, which I'm going to take a second to look up where Tumbleton actually is, and then get back to you to discuss everything great about this episode, because I don't think the first half really grabbed me. I mean, this is meant to be, like the start of season 3 proper, with season 2's events dealt with. Rhaenyra's in charge. We're just getting into the nitty-gritty of what it means to rule. But oh my god, as this episode gets into the second half, it just gets more and more exciting, and I can't wait for next week now. It's so good. Okay, picking up again with a few things. First of all, I believe I've only ticked one thing off the bingo, so that's not great. The second thing I was going to say is Tumbleton is southwest of King's Landing apparently, but it's in the Reach, so the Hightower army definitely well on its way to King's Landing, but it's not like they're right outside it, which was kind of my fear. Thirdly, then, thoughts on this episode. So I thought at the start it was very odd structurally that they avoided the usual straight into the intro to play out that entire several minute long negotiating scene with Daemon and the Hightower army, and I looked at all that just as, okay, I guess they're trying to build up this Ormond Hightower guy, he'll come back later in the story somehow, but it hadn't left too much of an impression. And of course what it's all setting up is that magnificent twist near the end of the episode where you finally get someone who actually knows who the heck Daeron is, who lays eyes on him for entirely altruistic reasons, and is instantly like, oh my god, kid. I don't even know whether Alicent, if she could have hidden it, would have chosen to expose her or not, but Rhaenyra realizes looking at Alicent, oh my god, this is just a random kid. we have not actually yet seen Daeron on the show, which explains why they're kind of cagey about him in the last episode. This is all just a ruse so that we can keep Daeron back, which raises interesting questions, because if you think about Ormond Hightower's army choosing to settle from Old Town in the first place, but leave Daeron behind, but bring a decoy, that takes steps of thinking ahead to be like, we're going to try to relieve and save the capital, but under the assumption that we lose the capital, here's how we can make sure we haven't put our eggs all in one basket and we still have a Targaryen claimant safely back in Hightower. This revolt does not seem like it has the best odds to be, because they've got one dragon that's not currently with its rider, and the other side has like 8 or something. Like they're not in a significantly better position than they would have been if they had just gone to war with Daemon then and there. But what they do have, I guess, is they have Tumbleton, which means they have hostages of the Queen's realm, which means it's bad for PR if she attacks the town. In any case, my estimation of Ormond Hightower has definitely jumped up, because straight away what I get from this is, oh, okay, they very deliberately made choices here where, in terms of the casting, Ormond and the guy who plays Brasso, who I don't even know who the character is meant to be, but is standing with Ormond, these two, they look like big beefcakes. Not much going on upstairs. Potentially Ormond's a bit snobby, kind of lords. And now you're like, oh, I see. The whole time Otto was trying to groom, in the mentoring sense, Alicent into being his heir, but Ormond does seem to be his heir in the kind of field of plotting. And so I'm curious to see what the next move is for Ormond, because all through this episode, It's a strange one in that the point of the episode is about escalating tension on Rhaenyra, right? There's fantastic use of music and sound design throughout, so the tension just gets ratcheting up and up. There's these themes being explored around, is she going to be, cruel/strong, or is she going to be merciful/weak? Or the Hightower insignia is coming down through the episode. It's this kind of royal transition of her taking over and stepping up into the role of queen, which is all very interesting. There's a lot of good conflict there. As I mentioned in the bingo, there's no Aegon in this episode, there's no Aemond in this episode, there's no Kristen Cole in this episode. There is an ongoing civil war, but for the duration of this episode, it is a case of we are triumphant in King's Landing. We are in fact so triumphant that we have the space and the time to think about things like feeding the peasants, which they hardly ever think about in Game of Thrones / A Song of Ice and Fire, which you can see later on in A Song of Ice and Fire is very much increasingly to the detriment of the powers that be. We've got time to think about these things. Daemon even has time to be overconfident and be all like, we have all this military force, why don't we just go on and conquer the entire world and fulfill the old Valyrian dream? And then at the end of the episode, the civil war comes roaring back into sight, because instantly it's like, oh, Ormond Hightower has a leg up on us, he has a valid claimant to the throne, so even if we deal with Aegon and Aemond, Daeron Targaryen can still sit the throne, has this rogue dragon out there, even if it's only one, even if it looked pretty small to me, may have other tricks up his sleeve. Where do we go from here? So I think that's a really exciting note to end off of. I'm just skimming through the episode now to see what other scenes I enjoyed. I enjoyed a lot the clash between the High Septon and Rhaenyra, the whole idea of the old institutions, the faith, the maesters, never really entirely accepting the Targaryens and their dragons. I loved Corlys going on Rhaenyra about her being too cowardly to recognize, ultimately, his own issue, which, to me, there are a lot of difficult choices presented throughout this episode. There are optics issues, or whatever you want to call it, but oh my god, Rhaenyra, the obvious choice here to me is clearly just recognize Adam and Alan. It does not have to reflect on yourself, and they've been such a valuable bit. It's not just about rewarding backers in the past, it's like you have Corlys and Alan leading what's left of your entire navy, what will lead to the entire future navy of the realm. You have Adam as one of your dragon riders. I think it's very important that you don't just say to them vaguely, one day you can have what you want. I think their experience, and Corlys's experience in particular, is very valuable. I don't think you just fob them off like that. I don't know what they're going to do now, because they could be so easily banked for your side, and all you really have to take in return for it is an optics issue, which to me doesn't matter too much, because like how many people in the realm really know who the Valerons are or care about in terms of the common people is what I mean, because with the lords, ultimately, what are they going to do if you recognize Adam and Alan and they're like, oh, I'm further disgruntled about the legitimacy issues? Are they going to throw in with Aegon and Aemond? Not at this stage. Like, it's going to be other factors that will mainly be the driving cause of whether the civil war goes on or not. So I like that conflict, and I like the knighting of the 3 dragon seeds off the white, Hugh the Hammer, which is very cool, and Adam of Hull, poor Adam of Hull, who deserves to be Adam Valeron. So at this stage, I've talked about everything I loved about this episode, except for one final thing, which is it feels like the best exploration we've seen so far in any of these shows of the idea of a monarch trying to appeal to the commons. The closest we really got to that was in Game of Thrones, such as Song of Ice and Fire, how Marjorie in particular is quite good at reaching out to the public, but that's still just relatively vague imagery. What I really like here is there is a debate that is, in a political science sense, coded as populist versus institutional, where on the one side you have those that are like, let's not upset the apple cart with the lords that be. You know, this is the Daemon side of the argument. And the other side is the Mysaria side of the argument, saying the common people have especially suffered in this conflict. Let's go look after them. And so I really like that this doesn't just end up being some pithy speech. It is an actual substantive, well, not substantive per se, but it's a really big populist gesture, an exciting swing that Rhaenyra takes when she serves them all up rats. It's not, I wouldn't call it advice, but it's exciting to watch. And when she's handing food out to the people of the city, The two things I really like are, number one, it's still mentioned it, to be clear. This is just a gesture. This will not last. This is just a temporary one-off cash-in to, put off incoming disaster. But the other thing is that I feel like it's so coded into the cynicism that seems to come into the writing of things like Game of Thrones and so on, for her to kind of botch the speech and be disliked and have tomatoes thrown at her. And it's really nice to see just once a scene where it actually comes off successfully. It's like there are stormy waters ahead. The people could turn on her. I don't know. But in this moment, for now, the fickle crowds are very satisfied with what she's doing. And that to me makes it a much more interesting story. If it could have done with anything else, I think to me it just would have been a bit more deftness around exploring the idea of she caused the blockade, she caused a lot of this hunger, and now here she is to rectify it. Offer perfectly valid justifications for this, not necessarily by 21st century human rights law kind of standards, but in the story you can just be like, I had a blockade to try to overthrow the tyrannical Greens and their supporters who were taking all your food away anyway. That's war. And now that I'm here, we're turning things around. We're opening it all up to you. It will be a better world than ever before. You have made sacrifices, and now we're here to turn the ship around. Just as I wish, similarly, when Rhaenyra served them all rat, I wish she had actually sat down for dinner and heard them out from there. But it's a good start. It's a good start for the show being more in an episode that's so focused on actually exploring governance. That's cool. The final thing is, I just remembered, because of talking about the one good thing that we get because she gets up and leaves the meal instead of everyone actually enjoying their rat, is we get to see a Manderley. Finally, I think technically a Manderley appears in Game of Thrones, but we get a proper scene with a Manderley that just instantly feels Manderley coded. I'm not going to get too into the Manderleys in case this guy does become a recurring character, but they are one of the most inexplicable cuts from Game of Thrones. They're a northern house, and in A Song of Ice and Fire and A Dance with Dragons, the Manderleys get to be so interesting, and it's such a crime to me that they didn't make it into the show, because they would have fit so seamlessly with everything else going on. There's such a good monologue at one point from a Manderley, and yeah, I just really hope that this guy kind of gets to embody what Wyman Manderley never got to be in a Game of Thrones, because if you have read A Dance with Dragons, you know that you get some cool scenes between the Manderleys and other characters. And that's all I'll say, and I'll leave it at that. For this episode of Bingo Chicken, only one bingo checked off, 7 of 25 out of the entire bingo card, but I really loved this episode and I'm really excited to see what comes next. So if you enjoyed this episode, then make sure to comment about what was your favorite part. If you didn't, then do the same thing. Like the video if you liked it. If you didn't like it, I hope you can find it within your heart to watch the next one, and to that end you should make sure to subscribe so you get a notification when it comes along. I'll catch you next week. Stay housed in the dragon.